Let me start this conversation in a place that may feel familiar to many of you, especially the attorneys listening. Most of the time, when an IRA shows up in an estate plan, it's treated as a background asset. It's listed, it's acknowledged, it's coordinated with beneficiary designations, and then the real planning energy goes towards the trust, the business interest, the real estate, the gifting strategies, the things that feel like they actually move the needle. And in many cases, that approach is completely reasonable. But there's a subset of clients, not rare, not exotic, where that assumption quietly kind of breaks down. These are clients with large pre-tax IRAs that are not needed for income, and where the IRA is functionally a legacy asset, whether the family has labeled it that way or not. And, excuse me. And in those cases, the IRA may become one of the most inefficient, fragile, and destructive assets in the entire estate. Not because anyone made a mistake, but because of how multiple tax regimes stack on top of each other. Let me explain what I mean at a high level. So a traditional IRA is by definition a pre-tax asset. We all know that. That means every dollar inside it is already spoken for, at least in part. The government has a claim on it. The only question is when and how aggressively that claim shows up. Now, layer in two very real possibilities. First, the client may have a taxable estate, not always, but often enough at the levels we're talking about. And when that's the case, the IRA is included in the gross estate. Second, excuse me, regardless of whether there's an estate tax issue, the beneficiaries will eventually pay ordinary income tax on the distributions. And in many families, those beneficiaries are already high earners, already in top brackets, already living in high tax states. Excuse me, got something in my throat. Gotta love being live. So what you may end up with is an asset that is exposed to estate tax on the front end and income tax on the back end. Not theoretically, mechanically. And even though there is an income in respect of a descendant deduction that can potentially soften the blow, the math is still unforgiving. In some common scenarios, a large IRA may deliver less than 40 cents on the dollar to the next generation after all taxes are paid. And here's the key issue. That outcome is often invisible at the planning stage. Because when we say IRA, our brains still default to tax-deferred, retirement, later problem. But when the IRA is not needed for retirement income, it stops behaving like a retirement asset and starts behaving like a toxic legacy asset. That's the first shift that needs to happen conceptually. Now, I want to be very precise here. I am not saying that IRAs are bad. I am not saying this applies to all clients. I am not saying this replaces Roth conversions, charitable planning, or other well-established strategies. What I am saying is that there is a structural blind spot that shows up when large IRAs are treated as passive assets instead of active balance sheet problems. And this is where many sophisticated advisors, attorneys included, unintentionally step around the issue rather than through it. Because once you fully confront the math, the next question becomes uncomfortable. If this asset is likely to be heavily impaired by taxes no matter what we do, and if the client does not need the income, then why are we preserving it in its current form at all? The question opens the door to a very different kind of planning. Now, I want to show my screen here real quick, and let me do that. Let me just pull this up here. And you're going to see, there you go, you're going to see a simple box. This box here represents a large pre-tax IRA not needed for income. Now, historically, when advisors have tried to question or tried to answer that question, they've reached for partial solutions: Roth conversion spread over time, charitable remainder trust, strategic beneficiary planning. All of those may help, certainly. All of those have a place. But there is another framework, one that sits at the intersection of retirement law, insurance law, and estate planning, that many elite advisors simply have not been exposed to. Not because it's aggressive, not because it's illegal, but because it lives between silos. And that framework is what we're discussing today, and certainly in this series. And today I want to go a level deeper than last week, not to teach execution, not to sell a solution, but to help you see the architecture clearly enough that the light bulb turns on. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it, really. So let's talk about the framework itself. Again, everything I'm describing is case-dependent, fact-specific, and subject to professional review. Words like may, can, and in certain circumstances matter here, and they should. But conceptually, the structure works like this. We start with a large IRA that is not required for income. That's the gating condition. If the client needs the income, stop right there. This is not the conversation or the framework. Now, instead of treating the IRA as something to be slowly depleted or reluctantly preserved, we reframe it as a funding capacity, not funding for lifestyle, funding for structure. In certain circumstances, a portion of that IRA may be systematically distributed over a defined period, often 5 years, sometimes more, but it's typically a 5-year time frame. And those distributions may be used to fund premiums on a life insurance policy, but first through a defined contribution plan. Now, here's the part that usually makes people like you often lean forward. That policy is not owned personally. It's not dropped directly into an ILA on day one. It is not designed like a traditional retail insurance policy. Instead, the policy is initially owned inside the defined contribution plan, another qualified plan structure. Now, why does this matter? Because inside that qualified environment, the policy's early economics behave very differently. The design can emphasize conservative crediting, limited early growth, and critically, a suppressed fair market value during the early years. Now, this is not an accident. This is not a bug. This is part of the design. The goal in this phase is not to maximize illustrated performance over that time. The goal is to control the valuation mechanics. In many cases, the policy may be designed with premiums funded over a defined window, typically 5 years, a death benefit that increases during that funding period, and assumptions run at very conservative rates, often around 4 to 4.5. Why do we do so conservative in that arena? Because this is not about selling upside. It's about stress testing survivability. A design that works at 4.5% may survive far worse conditions than one that only looks good at 6+. Now, after the funding period is complete, something important happens. At that point, and again, this is case specific and subject to applicable law, the policy may be transferred out of the qualified plan at its fair market value. This is why we structure it as such, to minimize that FMV. This is often referred to as a swap, though the mechanics matter greatly. So you can see my little drawing here, basically this fourth box being the ILET, the grantor trust. Now, the governing authorities that are often cited for this include DOL, PTE 92-6, and Revenue Procedure 2005-25. Now, though I want to be very clear, citing law is not the same as applying it. Proper counsel and administration are essential. What matters conceptually is this: the ILET acquires the policy that is fully funded, conservatively designed, and now sitting outside the taxable estate. The defined benefit plan retains that value, that fair market value, the swap value, and the IRA has now been partially or entirely repositioned. And the beneficiaries are no longer staring down the same tax math they were before. It's a simplified example. And actually, let me re-say that. In a simplified, illustrated example, a $5 million IRA that may have delivered only a fraction of that value after taxes could, through this structure, support a significantly larger tax-exempt death benefit for heirs. Not because of magic, not because of loopholes, but because the asset was re-architected, not optimized. I want to remove this, just get this off my screen here real quick. Okay, very good. And that distinction matters. This is not about squeezing extra basis points. This is not about chasing returns. This is about changing the tax character and dollars that were already impaired. Now, I want to say something important to the attorneys listening. Your role here is not to design the policy. Your role is not to run illustrations. Your role is not to memorize insurance mechanics. Your role is to recognize when the problem exists. Because once you see a large IRA sitting inside an estate plan unused for income, exposed to layered taxation, you are looking at a planning opportunity that most professionals still don't see. And when you understand the framework well enough to say, hey, there may be a way to reposition part of this or all of this asset structurally, let's explore it with the right specialist, you're no longer reacting to the balance sheet, you're shaping it. This is the shift. This strategy, this is the shift that this strategy invites. Not product thinking, not tax tricks, but architectural thinking. And that's why when we walked through the framework with attorneys recently, slowly, just visually, conceptually with them, their reaction hasn't been skepticism, it's been recognition. Because once the pieces are laid out clearly, the question isn't, is this aggressive? The question becomes, why haven't we been looking at IRAs this way before until now? And that's the conversation I want to leave with you today. Next week, I want to continue building on this, not by teaching execution, but by examining design decisions and where they go wrong when incentives or assumptions creep in. For now, if this caused even one small shift in how you look at large IRAs inside of estate plans, then this live did exactly what it was meant to do. Thanks for joining me today. Have a great day.